Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Daily Devotional. So our Daily Devotional today is coming from a article that was posted back on the 20th. It says Catholic officials on edge after reports of priests using Grindr, which is an app for mostly for homosexual individuals. The reports hit the Roman Catholic Church in rapid succession. Analyses of cell phone data obtained by a conservative Catholic blog seem to show priests at multiple levels of the Catholic hierarchy in both the United States and the Vatican using the gay hookup app Grindr. And there's a lot more to this article. I'm not going to focus on some of the background politics and some of the other stuff that they're bringing up and some of the specifics regarding the cell phone data. The reports have put church officials in an awkward position. Priests take a vow of celibacy that is in no way flexible, and the downloading or use of dating apps by clergy members is inconsistent with that vow. But officials are also deeply uncomfortable with the use of cell phone data to publicly police priests' behavior. Vatican officials said they met with representatives from the blog in June, but would not publicly respond to those reports. If someone who has made promise of celibacy or a vow of chastity has a dating app on his or her phone, that is asking for trouble. There's more stuff involved in this. In a podcast, so the two main individuals, they used to be Vatican, the lawyers for the Vatican or Catholic lawyers. In a podcast, Flynn and Condon, these are the individuals who provided the cell phone data. Flynn and Condon said their work was motivated by desire to expose a secretive culture of wrongdoing within the church. Immoral and illicit sexual behavior on the part of clerics who are bound to celibacy, but also on the part of other church leaders, could lead to a broad sense of tolerance for any number or kinds of sexual sins. Again, I'm not focusing on a whole lot of this other stuff. I'm just focusing on certain elements that I wanted to bring out. So one of the spokespeople for the Archdiocese, Maria Margiotta, she said church officials are reviewing the findings, and then she said this: "It is not acceptable for any member of the clergy to use any app, social media, or website in a way that is inconsistent with church teachings and their own religious vows. We are committed to protecting the faithful, and when we learn of immoral behavior or misconduct, we immediately respond appropriately to address concerns." So, this is not really anything new. The Catholic Church has had, and not just the Catholic Church, but many other Christian religious organizations that employ vows of celibacy or vows of chastity. They also have these types of issues. And it makes me think about what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 20. Paul, it sounds like this is something, obviously this isn't new. This is something that was happening 2,000 years ago. Starting in verse 20. "Therefore, if you died with Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men." So notice, first of all, Paul is not condemning the idea of law. He's not condemning the idea of quote-unquote regulations in the sense that God has dictated certain laws, certain things we're not to be involved in, certain things we're not to consume or to ingest or whatever. But Paul specifically bringing out the things that are according to the commandments and doctrines of men. And then he says in verse 23, and this is perhaps the most telling part of all of it, "These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh." It's a beautiful statement from Paul to show the disconnect between certain laws of man or doctrines of man or traditions of man as in connection with the service to God compared to the actual state of mind and the actual state of the heart and the attitude involved in dealing with temptation and so forth. Just because you make a rule that priests, for instance, can't marry, and priests take that vow, is that going to any way keep them from having impure thoughts? No, it's not. And for that matter, is it going to necessarily keep them from doing things that are wrong, as we see evidence of? No, it's not. And so it's interesting that, Paul makes a statement 2,000 years ago, and for 2,000 years, man's laws, man's rules that they ordain outside of God's law continue to cause problems. And I think this is and again, I'm not just picking on the Catholic Church, and I know sometimes it seems that way. Again, a lot of these articles get sent my way by Google because I think it thinks that I'm Catholic or for some reason. But regardless, these articles keep popping up. But this applies in a lot of ways. Certainly, it can apply to us as well as members of the Lord's body, to recognize that we have to be very clear in our mind as to what is tradition, what we do. We may have good reasons for doing it, but the things that we do that are not bound by God, that we recognize are not bound by God, versus the things that God does bind, or what God doesn't bind, to make sure we recognize the difference. And as a result, when Paul says these things they look like they're wise, they look like it's religious importance, but the verse 23, when he describes the appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion, God hasn't imposed that. God hasn't made a rule or a law about that. And you notice he says neglect of the body, but they are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. In the end, making these rules, making these laws by man, and then saying if you don't do these things, you're not holy. That's the problem. That's the issue that's being faced by churches who impose these types of rules and laws outside of what God says. And we have to be very careful that we remember that. That we remember that just because you make a rule that, and you make a rule and a priest makes a vow of poverty, or they make a vow of chastity or whatever, that doesn't necessarily prevent someone from having issues with sexual thoughts. That doesn't necessarily prevent somebody from having issues with the desire or love of money, or covetousness. And so you can make rules all you want to, but that's not going to change anything. And that's what Paul's point is. Why would you bind where God hasn't bound? Do you think God needs help in making the law more holy, or in making you holy? Do you think making more rules is what's going to help you be more holy? And unbinding where God has bound is also kind of on the other side of this. This is mainly the binding of laws that God hasn't bound. But there's also the other flip side of it, is unbinding where God has bound, particularly in worship, way we worship God in marriage, divorce, remarriage, and other areas like that. Both of those are major problems in the religious community. Binding where God hasn't bound, and unbinding where God has bound. And if we would just commit ourselves and submit ourselves to what God has said, and then distinguish the fact that yes, there are traditions of men that have a purpose. Okay, we meet on Sunday mornings. We have Bible class first. We have worship. Usually those worship services follow a familiar pattern. That's cultural. Okay, how our worship services are here in terms of order of service may not be the way they are in the Philippines or in India or anywhere else. But these things are there to help provide, to maintain order. First of all things being done decently and in order, 1 Corinthians 14, but also to provide an understanding and structure of what to expect. so that everybody knows what's happening. And that's one of the reasons we, at the Wichita Falls congregation, we have it posted on the PowerPoint. Here's our order of service. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. Nobody's confused, and everybody can be on the same page. And but still, there are many things that are connected to that aspect that are cultural. And with regard to that, we have to acknowledge that. Dressing up for worship service, for instance, that is a cultural component. That was not something you see in the New Testament. Now, is it wrong to dress up for worship? No. Is it wrong to expect people to dress up for worship if you have certain specifics or guidelines that you have to wear? I think that's maybe pushing it a little. Maybe we shouldn't be that far with it. But our culture, when you dress up, it suggests that there's something important. It suggests that you're doing something. And as long as that's the case, I think that we should continue to do that if we have the opportunity and we have the ability, obviously. Some people coming straight from work, or some people who have to go to work straight from worship service, may not be able to do that. But again, that's another example of human tradition that sometimes, and I have known of Christians who, very traditional Christians, if you weren't wearing a suit and tie, you weren't dressed up, and you were not doing what was right, and God wants you dressed up. That's not true. That's not true. And so it's important that we separate tradition from what God says, and that we recognize the differences between the two. And certainly that we do not bind where God has bound, and we don't unbind where God we don't unbind where God is bound. We don't bind where God hasn't bound. All right, that's the daily devotional for you today. Just something that I came across that I was thinking about, and I got to thinking. Immediately thought of Colossians 2:23, and Paul addressed this 2,000 years ago. You can make all the rules and laws you want, but that's not going to change anything. Okay, God has provided certain things for a reason. Okay, He's provided men and women the opportunity of marriage for a reason. Yes, companionship. Yes, for emotional and mental reasons, but also for fleshly reasons, for the sexual relationship. That's what that's designed for. The very statement that the man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That is a sexual reference. The two shall become one flesh. Paul specifically acknowledges that as being, to the Corinthians, as being a sexual reference. So, I mean, it's those types of things when you start saying, well, but to be holier, you should abstain from being married. You should deny yourself. You should take a vow of poverty or take a vow of chastity. And that makes you holy. No, it doesn't. And that's exactly what Paul's point is. All right, our next day of the devotion will be tomorrow at 6:30. So, Lord willing, I'll see you all then. Thanks, everybody.